Tyler didn't even close the door behind him. Just let it swing wide, the bell above clanging against the frame like a bell tower at a funeral. Cold air rushed in, making the sawdust on the floor swirl around George's boots like a ghost refusing to leave. He stood there for a full minute, sanding blocks still in one hand, heart somewhere between his ribs and the ragged floorboards. There had been fights before, plenty, but not like this. This wasn't a disagreement. This was an execution. His son had just severed something, and George could feel the cut bleeding under his ribs. Outside, Tyler's Tesla hummed away like a spaceship from another planet. George didn't watch it go. He sat down on the stool, the same stool his father used when he taught him how to chisel corners tight and flush without fillers. The old clock ticked in the corner, the one that hadn't chimed in years. And the silence in that shop, it wasn't peace. It was abandonment. The wood in front of him, red oak, straight grain, custom bench for a local church, blurred out of focus. Tyler hadn't just asked for money. He wanted the shop, the machines, the soul. He wanted George to kill the thing that had given them both a life, just to fuel some pitch deck fantasy cooked up in a rented WeWork space in San Francisco. Tyler didn't see legacy. He saw leverage. And the worst part? That last look on his son's face. Pure contempt. Like George was a relic. A rotary phone in the age of AI. He'd said it with a smirk too. I never needed you. George had heard a lot in his life. He'd heard his mother cry when his father didn't come home on time. Heard the machines break down one by one during the Carter recession. Heard Tyler's first cry in the hospital, his wife's breathless laugh. But nothing ever rang quite as deep as that one sentence, that one rejection. It hit in the chest like a slow punch, delayed pain, spreading wide. The next morning, George opened the shop like always, 6:45 a.m. sharp. He swept the floor, brewed the same bitter pot of diner coffee, unlocked the tool cabinets. He didn't talk about it. Didn't tell Walter next door, didn't call his sister. Tyler was gone. That was that. The chisel line in the oak bench he'd been working on, it was slightly crooked. He sanded over it anyway. And if you've made it this far into my story, and you're one of those folks who listens without subscribing, go ahead and hit that button. It lets the team know this kind of story matters, that it's worth carving out. 3 weeks passed before George even opened Tyler's old room upstairs. Dust everywhere. That stupid poster of a Bitcoin rocket still on the wall. On the desk, one old flip phone with a dead battery. Probably hadn't touched it since high school. George didn't touch anything. Just stood there a while. Then shut the door again. The call stopped. No texts. Tyler vanished like he'd never existed. The only reminder George had was the echo of that slammed shop door, and the stack of untouched invoices from clients who still, somehow, respected hand-cut dovetails more than drone-delivered dropships. One day, George got an email from a supplier asking if he was really retiring. Apparently someone, anonymous Gmail address, had contacted them saying Granger Woodworks would be closing. George stared at the screen for a long time, then closed the laptop, walked downstairs, and sharpened every blade in the shop. Twice. He didn't reply. He didn't fight back. He just kept building. Quiet. Alone. Determined. That's how his father built it. That's how he'd keep it. If his son wanted to be the next tech savior, fine. But George wasn't going to be sacrificed at the altar of scalable disruption. Then came Thanksgiving. The one George pretended not to care about anymore. He still roasted the turkey. Still made the damn cranberry sauce nobody ever ate. Set 2 places. One for himself. One for the ghost of someone who might someday remember what love built. The chair across from him stayed empty. But George poured the wine anyway. 3 years went by, then 5. George could mark them not by birthdays or calendars, but by the increasing silence. No calls. No emails. The only sound from Tyler's orbit came through third parties, George's sister, mostly, who still tried to act like there was a thread worth tying back together. Every Christmas, she mailed George a photo. One year Tyler in a blazer at some tech summit. Another year, him holding a giant check and standing next to a beaming, spray-tanned investor in front of a step-and-repeat banner. George never replied. He kept the envelopes in a drawer behind the register, unopened. The shop carried on. Orders still came in. Less, maybe, but enough. Local clients. A school commission here. A church altar refurb there. George stopped taking on apprentices. Too much talking. Too much explaining. The machines knew him and didn't ask questions. That was enough. One Thanksgiving, sometime around year 6, George woke up like it was any other day. But his body remembered. The smells, the rituals. He pulled the turkey from the freezer at 6 a.m. and set it on the counter. Not because he was expecting anyone, but because he always had. By 2 p.m., The house filled with the kind of warmth you can't fake with a thermostat. Cinnamon from the pie, butter from the rolls. He laid out the good plates. Iron napkins. 2-place settings, just like always. He even poured the water with a flourish, like Tyler was going to walk in late, half apologetic, complaining about traffic or flights. He'd say, "Smells the same, at least," and George would grunt like he wasn't relieved. But the door stayed closed. No knock. No text. Nothing. He sat down, carved the turkey with a precision that came from 35 years of practice, not celebration. Plated a thigh and a breast. Served stuffing. Gravy. A scoop of green beans with the little almonds his wife used to toast. Across the table, the empty chair stared back, silent and smug. Then came the knock. George didn't flinch, just kept chewing. Walter pushed the door open with his elbow, balancing 2 disposable plates and a 6-pack of warm beer. "Figured you'd ignore me again," the old man muttered, kicking off his boots. "But Doris made extra. And if I eat another slice of that overcooked bird she calls turkey, I'm going to start laying eggs." George nodded to the chair across from him. Still open. Walter sat, grunting. "You hear from him?" "Nope." "Figures." They ate in near silence, punctuated only by Walter's slurps and the clink of cutlery. After a while, Walter leaned back and let out a satisfied groan. Some sons grow out of their fathers. Others just run. George didn't respond. He was still chewing, slow and deliberate, as if each bite was something he didn't want to swallow. Across from him, the other plate stayed untouched, as full as the first moment it was served. A plate for the version of Tyler that might have come home, might have said, "I messed up," might have cared. Instead, that Tyler lived only in George's head, and in the still air of the dining room. After Walter left, George wrapped the untouched plate in foil, labeled it with a single word, "Son," and slid it into the back of the fridge. It would sit there for 4 days before he finally tossed it out, still untouched. That night, George climbed into bed without turning on the TV. The house creaked the way it always did in November. But something felt heavier than usual, like a beam was just starting to sag. He looked over at the nightstand, where a framed photo of Tyler at age 10 still stood, holding a carved toy boat they'd built together. George reached over, turned it face down, and clicked off the lamp. The snow was coming in slantways that morning, sharp, dry flakes skimming across the sidewalk like tiny razors. George had only half-lit the shop, trying to save on power. The back furnace hadn't kicked in yet, and even with 3 layers on, his fingers ached as he shaped a walnut cabinet leg. The radio muttered static in the corner, long since tuned to a forgotten channel, just enough sound to keep the ghosts out. Then the bell rang. He looked up, half expecting Walter or maybe one of the local kids with another, "Can you fix this stool for my grandma?" request. Instead, it was a girl. A skinny one, maybe 16, 17 at most. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, puffed around her like she'd borrowed it from a man twice her size. The scarf wrapped around her neck was unraveling at one end. One glove had holes at the fingertips, and her boots were wet clear through. She stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to enter all the way. "You hiring?" she asked. Her voice was barely there. George had to lean slightly to catch it over the hiss of the furnace finally sputtering to life. He set the cabinet leg down, brushing off with dust. "Not really, kid. Shop slow." She nodded once, no disappointment in her eyes, like she'd expected that answer. She turned, hand already on the door. Then George's stomach dropped. It was the eyes. Big, watchful, a shade between green and hazel that didn't quite belong to her frame, but did to someone else George had once known better than himself. "Wait." She stopped, hand still on the handle. He stepped closer, peering at her face now, really looking. The shape of her chin, the slight dip in her nose bridge. Familiar, but with something softer overlaid. "What's your name?" "May," she said, without turning around. "Who's your mother?" This time she did turn. "I don't know." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't know. She wasn't around much. There was a woman named Erin for a while, but not really. Most times, I was with other people." George's throat tightened, but he kept his voice flat. "What about your father?" "Tyler," she said. "Tyler Granger." The words hit like a hammer to the ribs. Not a guess. Not maybe. Not I think. Just Tyler Granger. George didn't move. The furnace groaned in the background, wood crackled in the back burner, and the radio gave a hiccup of static like it, too, had caught its breath. "Come here," he said, trying not to let the quiver slip into his tone. May stepped cautiously forward, close enough now that he could see her cheeks were wind-burned raw, one eyelid slightly bruised. A healed-over scratch curved along her jawline. The scarf around her neck was patterned, blue and brown stripes, but faded, pilled at the edges. George didn't know why, but it unsettled him. Not the scarf itself, but the fact that it had clearly been worn for years. Passed down, not bought. "How'd you find this place?" he asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "He told me if anything ever went wrong, if I ever needed help, I should come here. Said this was his dad's shop. That you'd know." George stared at her like she was a carving he couldn't figure out how to finish. The shape was there, the outline, but the details didn't make sense. Tyler had never mentioned a kid. Never once. Not in the years he begged George for money. Not in the years he disappeared afterward. George didn't even know if Tyler had ever lived with someone named Aaron. And yet here she was. This walking contradiction. This shivering echo of something left unsaid. He exhaled through his nose, slow. "You want tea?" She nodded. He walked toward the kettle. Behind him, her boots squeaked as she stepped fully inside, finally letting the door shut. The shop felt colder, somehow, even as the heater kicked on. George poured 2 mugs. Set one on the workbench. She gripped it with both hands, trembling fingers barely able to hold the ceramic. "You said he visited you?" "Sometimes. Holidays. Birthdays if he remembered. But not lately. Not for 2 years. And you lived where?" "All over." She didn't elaborate, and George didn't press. She looked like someone who had been trained not to give too much away. He watched her sip the tea like it was liquid gold. She closed her eyes when she drank. Relief, not pleasure. George swallowed hard. "Do you have any proof?" he asked gently. May reached into her backpack, a fraying green thing with a broken zipper, and pulled out an envelope. Yellowed, folded and refolded. The name written on the front in faded ink. Dad's shop. Only if things go really bad. Below it, the handwriting that made George's breath catch in his chest. Slanted. Sharp. Always in all caps. Tyler Granger. It was his son's writing. George didn't open it. He didn't have to. The world had already tilted. And across from him sat the reason why it could never tilt back. George didn't open the envelope. Not right away. He turned it over in his hand, while May sipped her tea like someone who hadn't had a warm drink in weeks. The paper was soft from wear, yellowed and creased at every edge like it had been folded, unfolded, and refolded 100 times. It didn't weigh much, maybe a page inside, 2 at most, but it felt heavier than the oak slab he'd been planing earlier that morning. The handwriting on the front was Tyler's. No doubt. All caps. Angular. Always pressing too hard with the pen like he was trying to tattoo the paper instead of write on it. Only if things go really bad. That's what the bottom corner read, scrawled in his usual urgency. The kind of panic Tyler tried to disguise as confidence. George set the envelope aside and looked back at May. She was sitting on the stool by the lathe, cup cradled in both hands like a small animal. Her fingers were raw, calloused in strange places, not just the tips like someone who did detail work, but the sides too. Palms toughened unnaturally young. "Where'd you stay last night?" he asked gently. She looked up, startled. "A shelter." "Which one?" She shrugged. "The one off 18th. George exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his beard. That shelter had been shut down a year ago. Rats. Mold. The city never officially closed it. They just stopped returning calls and let it rot. "You been sleeping rough?" "I've been fine." He didn't press. "Not yet. You said there was a woman named Aaron?" May nodded. "She was around when I was little." "Not really, Mom. She just handled things. She'd leave for a long time, come back with rent money or bags of food." "What happened to her?" "She disappeared." May said it like she was describing the weather. I asked him about it. He said she ran off. George nodded slowly. "And these other people, who were they?" "Sometimes friends of his. Sometimes strangers. One woman had 6 of us in a 2-bedroom. Another place, the guy made us pay rent in cash, but never gave us a key. I'd sleep with the back door propped open." George's jaw clenched. He picked up the envelope again, just to keep his hands from shaking. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come here now?" She looked down at her tea, then at her fingers, fidgeting with the rim of the cup. "Because the last place, they took my bag when I was sleeping. I had everything in there. My ID, my last $20, even my shoes. I walked here in these." She lifted her foot, soaked canvas sneakers, soles half detached. "I remembered he said this was his dad's shop. Said you'd help me if I ever needed it." "Did he say what kind of help?" May shook her head. "No. Just go to the shop." Like it was obvious. I didn't know what to expect. George stood and walked to the back wall, where he kept an old army footlocker filled with coats and boots left by past apprentices. He found a pair of wool socks and some work boots, men's size 8, Close enough. Laid them at her feet. She stared at them for a moment before slipping them on. No thank you. No fuss. Just quiet, tired efficiency. Then he opened the envelope. Inside was a single note. No date. No salutation. If May shows up, that means something's gone sideways. I can't explain it all. There isn't time. Just help her. Please. She's not safe. And whatever she tells you about me, don't believe it all. Some things I had to do. That was it. No address. No number. Not even a signature. But it didn't matter. George knew Tyler's guilt when he saw it. And that note reeked of it. She said you'd help, May whispered. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Just the floor. But I wasn't sure if that was true. George folded the note, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. You hungry? May nodded. Still didn't look up. I've got stew in the back. They ate in silence. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She just ate, 3 bowls worth, and then washed her own dishes. When she tried to put the boots back by the door, George shook his head. Keep them. She blinked. You sure? I don't hand out boots as decoration. That got the smallest flicker of a smile. It vanished as fast as it came. Later, George sat alone at the bench with the envelope on the table beside him. He looked at the girl sleeping in the corner on the cot he hadn't used in years, curled up like she'd been trained not to take up space. The scarf she'd worn was folded next to her, brown and blue stripes. It was Tyler's, he realized, from when he was a teenager. George remembered buying it from a flea market on a road trip with his wife. Tyler had hated it, called it old man fashion, but he'd worn it when she asked. Why would he give that scarf to her? George stared at the chisel in his hand. The sharp edge, the precise control. Something was deeply wrong here. And Tyler, wherever he was, wasn't finished with the damage. Not even close. The morning after May arrived, George woke before dawn, boots already half-laced before his alarm buzzed. He moved through the shop quietly, careful not to wake her. She was still curled up on the cot under an old wool blanket, breathing steady for the first time since she walked in. Something in him felt protective. No, responsible. The kind of bone-deep responsibility he hadn't felt since Tyler was 10 and broke his arm falling from the back porch. Only this time, it wasn't as simple as a hospital visit and a cast. By mid-morning, George was in the county clerk's office, which hadn't changed in 20 years. Still smelled like dust and toner. The clerk behind the glass wore the same expression as every bureaucrat since the Eisenhower administration, board vigilance. I need to check some records. Looking for a woman named Erin. Lived with or near a Tyler Granger maybe 10, 15 years ago. Child involved. The clerk typed with 2 fingers, mouth twisted in mild suspicion. You a relative? I'm the child's grandfather. Legal. George hesitated, trying to find out. She squinted at the screen. We've got 7 Erins matching that name within the past 20 years. You got a middle initial? No. Address. He gave the last one May vaguely remembered. Something like Florence Street. The clerk frowned. No Florence Street in this county. Closest is Florence Drive, but that's out near the industrial park. And we don't have any resident records matching that name on Florence Drive. What about birth certificates? Name of the child? May. Could be May Granger. Could be May something else. She doesn't know. The clerk searched for 5 minutes, then shook her head. No birth certificate filed under May with Granger as the father. Nothing linked to a Tyler Granger at all. Nothing. George pressed. Not even a traffic ticket, sir. He left with the clerk's polite smile still stuck in his teeth like a splinter. Back at the shop, May was folding rags in the corner like it was her job. She looked up when he came in, eyes expectant, but he didn't say anything. Just nodded. He didn't want to rattle her, not yet. Not until he had more than a gut feeling. That night, he pulled out an old Rolodex from the filing cabinet and flipped through until he found the card. Franklin Payne, Army Logistics. Now a private investigator, last George heard. He called. Frank. It's George. The pause on the other end was warm. Well, I'll be damned. You still breathing? Barely. They talked for a minute. Then George got to the point. I need someone looked into. Quietly. By the following Tuesday, the report arrived in a plain brown envelope. George opened it at the workbench, May outside sweeping the sidewalk like it mattered. The first page showed a photo. Erin, mid-30s, smiling faintly in what looked like a DMV photo. Blonde. Thin. The kind of wear on her face that suggested life hadn't gone easy. She died 7 years ago. Motel fire outside Albany. Accidental, the report said. But the building was condemned, and the alarm system hadn't worked in years. No next of kin listed. Just one burned suitcase and a necklace with no engravings. Page 2 made his stomach turn. No birth certificate for May. No adoption record. No custody paperwork. No state aid filings. No school enrollment forms. No social security enrollment. She wasn't even in the state immunization database. George stared at the words. Subject appears to have been deliberately omitted from formal systems. Deliberately omitted. Like someone had made sure she didn't exist. Like someone had erased her. The next few pages detailed the sequence. Erin listed no father on her own documents. No hospital ever recorded a birth matching May's profile in that time frame. And Tyler? No link. No filings. Not even a whisper of paternity. George turned to the last page. Conclusion. Individual named May likely fell through legal cracks or was intentionally kept off grid. Circumstantial evidence suggests deliberate concealment. And then, in Frank's handwriting, Tyler's name pops up only once, in a flagged but sealed housing complaint. No charges filed. Address listed, 217 Florence Street. George blinked. Florence Street doesn't exist. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the papers back into the envelope. That night, he sat across from May over a plate of reheated stew. She spoke in small phrases. Thank you. I'll wash up. It's okay. But it wasn't okay. George knew now. Tyler hadn't just neglected her. He'd deleted her. Not abandoned, erased. Like a program glitch. Like a liability. He'd built a startup empire on efficiency and secrecy. May wasn't just inconvenient. She was exposure. Risk. Something he could never explain to investors or a potential IPO board. George stared at her. At the scarf. At the hollow under her eyes. She wasn't just lost. She'd been hidden. And the man who did it was his son. It was just past 2 a.m. when the crash woke him. Sharp, slicing through the silence like a nail driven into glass. George sat bolt upright, heartbeat already pounding in his ears. It wasn't a dream. The sound came from downstairs. From the shop. He grabbed the old bat he kept by the door, not for show, but for moments just like this, and crept down the narrow stairwell in wool socks, careful not to let the steps groan. The shop was dark, but he didn't need light to see what was wrong. The air had changed. It was colder. Moving. He reached the bottom step and paused. The side window, right above the grinder bench, was shattered inward. Not a rock tossed by teenagers. This was precise. Surgical. Someone had broken in quietly, almost professionally. No alarm. No spray paint. Just one neat entry point and the scent of cold air and metal. George flipped the breaker. The overhead fluorescence buzzed and flickered to life, and what he saw made his stomach twist. The shop wasn't ransacked, but it had been sorted through. Drawers pulled open just enough. Filing cabinets halfway slid. Not chaos. Curated mess. Like someone was looking for something specific. The register drawer was untouched. The display cases still sealed. But the small office near the back, the one where George kept decades of invoices, tax documents, and order forms, looked like a tornado had passed through with a lawyer's license. He didn't call the police. Not yet. Instead, he grabbed the broom, swept up the glass, and quietly cleaned up the mess by 4 a.m. He didn't want May waking up to see it. She needed sleep, not more reasons to feel hunted. But when he looked at the open cabinet drawer again, something snapped. 2 folders were missing. Not money. Not plans. Just business records. Specifically, tax filings from 2015 through 2018, the years Tyler had last been in contact. The years he'd first started the company. George didn't say anything the next morning. May was quiet. As usual, spooning oatmeal slowly while the space heater rattled beside her. He asked if she'd slept okay. She nodded. He didn't press. Her hands trembled when she lifted her cup. That afternoon, he drove across town to a feed store where the owner owed him a favor. Bought a surveillance camera kit for discrete black domes, motion-activated with night vision. Installed them himself before sundown, wiring them through the attic crawl space and into a second-hand DVR he mounted behind a false panel in the back office. By the next night, he wasn't sleeping, just sitting in his recliner, watching the feed flicker on a tiny monitor. At 2:19 a.m., a car rolled up. Black. Low. No headlights. Parked across the street for exactly 47 minutes. Nobody got out. No lights came on. Then it slowly pulled away. George didn't sleep that night either. The next evening, same car. Same time. Same ritual. On the third night, George had enough. He didn't confront them. Didn't grab the bat this time. He just picked up the phone and called the one person who'd understand what wasn't being said. Walter answered on the third ring. Yeah. It's me. You okay? Pause. I think someone's watching her. Walter was silent for a moment. Then, is she in trouble? I don't know, George admitted. But someone's after something. Broke in. Took files. Only tax records, nothing else. And now they're sitting outside every night like ghosts in a sedan. Walter exhaled, slow and gravelly. Tyler, I don't know, but whoever it is knows exactly what they're looking for. And I think she's part of it. You want me to come over? Not yet. Just be ready. In case this gets worse. George hung up, stared at the feed. The car was back. Same spot. No movement. It was like watching a silent accusation parked under a streetlight. He didn't tell May. She was laughing more that week. Just a little. Helping with sanding. Sweeping up dust. Even started carving again. She'd made a bird out of cherry wood. Rough, but promising. George couldn't take that away from her. Not yet. But inside, a cold certainty was forming. Whoever was watching them hadn't come for tools. They'd come for something buried in the past. And George was starting to wonder what, exactly, his son had built his empire on. Because someone out there was afraid of May. Which meant, finally, someone believed she existed. The voicemail blinked on the old answering machine George had stubbornly kept beside the shop phone. A dusty relic no one but debt collectors and hardware suppliers ever used anymore. The blinking red light had been going for a day or two, but he hadn't checked. Habit, mostly. He hated listening to people ask for things he no longer offered. But that morning, something made him press play. There was a click, followed by a chirpy voice with a brittle, businesslike tone. Hello, this is Elena from Bearstone Capital Group. We're trying to reach Mr. Tyler Granger regarding his equity commitment for the current investment round. He listed this address as his emergency contact and backup communication channel. If this is Mr. George Granger, could you please return our call at? George stopped the message before it could finish. He sat there, staring at the phone like it had just slapped him across the face. Backup communication channel? He hadn't spoken to Tyler in almost 7 years. No calls. No texts. Not even a damn holiday card. But now he was Tyler's backup. He scrolled through the message again, wrote down the number, and called. The line picked up on the first ring. A woman answered, bright voice, trained smile. Bearstone Capital, this is Elena. This is George Granger, he said, his voice low. You left a message. About my son. Yes. Mr. Granger, thank you for returning the call. We've been trying to get in touch with Tyler about the remaining portion of his equity match for the Heliox Series C round. He listed your name and this address as a backup in the partnership paperwork. George's jaw tightened. He did what? Yes, she continued, chipper as ever. Says you were the original backer from the initial capital structure. Legacy Capital, I think it was labeled. We just need to confirm. I never signed anything. A pause. I'm sorry. I never backed his company. Not with a penny. I told him years ago I wouldn't sell my business, and I sure as hell never agreed to be anyone's financial anchor. More silence on the line this time. Mr. Granger, she said carefully now. Our records say otherwise. His Form E lists Granger Woodworks as an affiliated entity, and your name is on the silent partner clause. George felt cold, like a draft had blown through his ribcage and put out every fire in him. I suggest you double-check, he said, and hung up. He didn't throw the phone, though his hands itched too. Instead, he turned to the shop windows, sunlight filtering in through the sawdust haze, everything golden and still. May walked in a moment later, cheeks pink from the cold, cradling something in both hands. I finished it, she said, grinning faintly. You said to keep the edges clean, so I tried. She held up a small ornament. Maple, hand-carved. A stylized reindeer with fine antler detail and a loop of twine through the top. George didn't respond, just stared. Her hands were covered in sawdust, smudges on her cheek from where she'd wiped sweat or wood grain or both. She was starting to look like she belonged here, like the shop recognized her as one of its own. Like his father would have nodded in approval at the way she held a chisel now, not with hesitation, but with intent. And yet, out there, Tyler was telling the world George had built his dream. Was that the angle all along? Claim the business as legacy capital, pitch it to investors as some bootstrap backstory, then vanish before anyone checked if the floorboards were real? Worse, what if he'd forged it all? Stuck George's name on documents without a word, dragged the family business into whatever spider web of IPO jargon and startup debt he'd built? George set the ornament down on the counter and looked at May. How long were you on your own? He asked quietly. She blinked. I don't know. Since I was 10? Maybe. He nodded, barely breathing. You had school. Sometimes. When we stayed in one place. But mostly not. I read stuff online. Watched videos. Did he ever talk about me? She shrugged. He said you were old-fashioned. That you didn't get it. Get what? I don't know. Just that you didn't believe. George closed his eyes. Not believe in Tyler? He put food in that boy's mouth, paid for his private high school, took out a second mortgage to fund that ridiculous West Coast internship. He believed until it hurt. And now his son had erased all that, rewritten it, made May into a secret, made George into a wallet he never used but kept in his pocket just in case. He opened his eyes and looked at her again. "That's a good reindeer," he said. She beamed, small but real. George went to the back office, opened the file cabinet, and pulled out every document with the business name on it: licensing forms, tax filings, contracts, bank statements. He began cross-referencing them with the years Tyler had launched Heliox. And what he found wasn't just theft. It was something worse, something deeper, something designed. Tyler hadn't just listed him. He'd built the empire on him. And now that empire was cracking, and someone was making sure George wouldn't be able to deny his part in it. May had walked into a shop with nothing but a scarf and an envelope. But somehow, she was the last real piece of truth left standing in a story built on lies. 2 days after the call with Bearstone Capital, the knock came. Sharp, precise, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission, it assumes it. George opened the door to find a man in a charcoal wool coat, tin briefcase in one hand, and a smirk that looked surgically installed. "George Granger?" the man asked, already stepping inside before George could answer. George closed the door behind him. "You're not with Bearstone?" "No, sir. Legal counsel. My name's Porter, representing Heliox Ventures in a private advisory capacity. Your son's company." He set the briefcase on the counter like it was a present he'd been waiting years to unwrap. May was in the back, humming faintly as she swept sawdust off the porch. The radio played something soft. George didn't call out to her. She didn't need to hear this. Porter unclasped the briefcase and laid out a stack of papers like a magician preparing a card trick. "Just a quick matter of cleanup," he said breezily. "Some documents we need to reaffirm, now that Tyler's equity structure is under scrutiny." George crossed his arms. "Scrutiny from who?" Porter looked up, amused. "From everyone, Mr. Granger. But that's not the concern today. This," he tapped the papers, "is the original silent partnership agreement you signed roughly 7 years ago. You provided family legacy funding. It allowed Tyler to secure pre-seed capital without needing external validation. I never signed any agreement." Porter didn't miss a beat. "I understand. Memory gets fuzzy with time." George's jaw tightened. Porter turned the paper toward him. At the bottom, in unmistakable ink, George's name. His signature. Except it wasn't. Not quite. It looked like his signature. Enough to fool a boardroom, but not enough to fool George. He'd never signed this paper. And he'd never given Tyler permission to use the shop name on anything. He'd said no. Plain and simple. "You're saying this is legal?" George asked. "I'm saying it's done," Porter replied. "And right now, the board is skittish. There are whispers. Regulatory audits. And it would be awfully inconvenient if the original partner," he tapped the name, "suddenly said he'd never signed. I didn't sign. And yet, you're listed as silent equity. Which means, if this becomes public, your credibility, your shop's name, your finances, they all get dragged into the storm." Porter smiled again. "Not kindly. But if you stay quiet, Mr. Granger, if you reaffirm, or even just decline to comment, we're prepared to offer a one-time payout. 7 figures. Untaxed." George didn't look at the paper. He looked past Porter, out the window. May was still sweeping. She had no idea. 7 figures, George repeated flatly. "Yes. And a non-disclosure agreement, of course. Simple stuff. You retire. Buy a cabin. Nobody gets hurt." George exhaled through his nose. "Except her." Porter tilted his head. "I'm sorry." George gestured toward the window. "May, the kid Tyler forgot existed." Porter blinked, just once, before recovering. "That girl is not formally connected to Mr. Granger." "No, she isn't," George said. "And whose fault is that?" Porter carefully restacked the papers. "I don't see how that's relevant to this arrangement." "It's relevant because she's the reason I didn't burn this shop down the day he left." The lawyer studied him. "Not like a man, like a variable. You understand the implications of going public with this?" he asked. "You understand what happens to him?" George's voice dropped to a hush. "I understand exactly what happens." Porter stood, smoothing his coat. "Take the weekend. Call me Monday. But I'll tell you now, Mr. Granger, people don't win when they fight the tide. They get drowned." George opened the door. Porter stepped out without another word. Back inside, George walked to the workbench, set down the papers, and ran his fingers across the wood grain like it could steady him. It didn't. He thought of the tax records that had vanished, the car that still parked outside every night, the broken window, and most of all, the forged signature. A theft not just of name, but of history. A lie polished to look like legacy. May walked in, wiping her hands on her jeans. She looked more alive this week than she had in years. Should I keep sweeping? George nodded slowly. Yeah, kid. Keep sweeping. But inside, something was shifting. Porter had offered him an exit. But George had never taken the easy door. Not when it meant leaving a mess behind. And not when the person who made the mess had his last name. The back office smelled like old varnish and colder regrets, like a place time forgot or chose not to remember. It had always been a kind of sanctuary for George, a place he came when the noise got too loud or the silence got too thick. The floor creaked under his boots as he walked in, slow and deliberate, and shut the door behind him. He hadn't been in there much since May arrived. Some part of him had avoided it, the way you avoid an attic full of boxes you're not ready to open. But now, with Porter's smirk still etched in his mind, and Tyler's betrayal laid out in bold, forged letters, George needed a memory that hadn't lied to him. Something solid, untouched. On the far wall, beneath a film of dust, hung a black and white portrait of his father, lean, broad-shouldered, standing beside the very first workbench that had ever graced this shop. That same bench still stood in the front room, sanded and oiled 100 times over. George had learned everything at that bench, from the way to hold a chisel to the way to hold your tongue. The frame had always seemed heavier than it should be. George reached up now, lifted it carefully off the hook, and flipped it around. And there, taped to the back of the frame with old yellowing Scotch tape, was a photograph. He hadn't seen it in decades. A baby, chubby cheeks, wide hazel eyes. Tyler, maybe 2 months old, wrapped in a flannel blanket, mouth open like he was already trying to lecture someone. George chuckled dryly, but it stuck in his throat. Beside the photo, folded once, was a note, written in his late wife's handwriting. He knew it instantly. Elegant, tight script, always written with a fountain pen like she was born in another century. Don't let him forget who we are. 6 words. George sat down slowly in the chair. Those 6 words felt like they'd been waiting. Like they were meant for this moment. Not some sweet nostalgic note, but a warning. A request. Maybe even a prophecy. Don't let him forget who we are. Not what we had. Not what we gave. Who we are. That was the heart of it. Tyler had spent years running from this place, but not because he hated it. Not because he thought it was small. George saw it now, clearly for the first time. Tyler had run because this shop, the smell of pine shavings, the bench his grandfather built, the tools with worn handles and oil stains, reminded him of her, of the mother who left. And instead of breaking the cycle, Tyler had kept it spinning. He didn't just vanish from May's life. He erased her, the same way he erased his own mother, the same way he'd tried to erase George. And yet, here was May, out sweeping the porch like it was her own, helping in the shop, learning to sand curves and hold a dovetail joint in place with just the right pressure. She hadn't run. She'd shown up, holding nothing but a threadbare scarf and a name. George folded the note, placed it gently into his front shirt pocket, and stood. He walked back into the main shop. May looked up as he entered. She was oiling a pine block, concentrating hard, tongue poking out slightly in focus. "Do we have any cherrywood left?" he asked. She nodded, pointing toward the stacked slabs near the back. "Bottom rack. Dry." He smiled faintly. "Good. Don't touch it. I'm using it." She didn't ask what for. George set the slab on the workbench, ran his hand along the grain, then began sketching lightly in pencil. The lines came slow at first, then clearer. It wasn't a chair, wasn't a bench. He was carving something that hadn't existed in the shop before. A crest. Not a logo, not a brand. Something deeper. Something that told a story in curves and hollows, not words. He didn't need Tyler's approval. He didn't need the payout. He was reclaiming the story, not just for himself, or his father, or even May, but for the legacy Tyler tried to twist into a marketing slogan. The chisels were sharper than he remembered. Good. Each strike had purpose now. Each curl of wood peeled back part of the past. At some point, May came over and silently began sharpening blades beside him. She didn't ask what he was making. She didn't need to. The shop, once cold and cracked with memory, had begun to breathe again. Not because Tyler came home, but because George finally understood. He didn't need to forgive the betrayal. He just needed to carve something that would outlast it. The door slammed open like it had in that first fight, years ago. Same sound. Same arrogant force. Only this time, Tyler didn't stride in like a prince returning to his kingdom. He stumbled, pale, wild-eyed. His coat hung off one shoulder. His phone was clutched in his hand like a detonator with no red button. George didn't look up from the carving. He was almost done now. maple inlays curling into the cherrywood crest, a family emblem he was inventing as he went. One hand rested near the chisel, the other calmly brushing away shavings. May stood behind the counter, wiping down finished pieces, steady as a metronome. The shop smelled of beeswax and heat and resolve. "What did you do?" Tyler's voice cracked like drywall, giving under pressure. He dropped his phone on the workbench like a man tossing evidence. The screen showed a string of emails, alerts, messages from investment firms and panicked board members. "You pulled the Anchor investment," he shouted. "They're backing out. Bearstone's out, Delgrove's following, and the Chinese fund won't wire without secondary validation." George finally looked up. Tyler's hair was matted, his eyes ringed with red. The smooth veneer had cracked, the charm was gone. All that remained was the boy who still thought bluffing could outpace reality. "You collapsed the deal," Tyler said, lower now. "Do you even understand what you've done?" "I understand exactly what I did," George replied. Tyler's lip curled. "You think this makes you noble? Huh? You think anyone's going to care that some old man and his broom closet of a business?" George gestured toward May. She hadn't flinched once since Tyler barged in. She stood upright, both hands planted on the counter, watching the exchange like someone watching the final move in a chess game that started before she was born. "I'm funding something else now," George said. Tyler blinked. Once. Twice. His mouth opened, closed. "She's not your kid," he snapped. "No," George said. "But she sure as hell isn't yours anymore either." Tyler took a step forward, eyes darting to the corner of the workbench where Porter's old contract sat folded beside a manila folder. George saw the flicker of recognition. He picked up the folder and handed it over. "Go ahead. Open it." Tyler hesitated. "It's all in there," George continued. "The forgery, the equity manipulation, the partnership lies, every piece of paperwork you doctored. I didn't just keep records, son. I kept the originals." Tyler opened the folder. His face changed one line at a time. Paled, twitched, tightened. "You're bluffing," he whispered. George nodded toward the DVR monitor in the back corner, the one that still had the time-stamped footage from the night of the break-in. "Check the footage. Or maybe ask the guy in the black sedan who's been parked outside all month." "They weren't watching me, Tyler. They were watching her. Because she was the untraceable variable you tried to delete, and now she's here, breathing, working, living proof." Tyler's hands shook. "If you go to the feds, I lose everything." "You already lost everything," George said quietly. "You just didn't notice until it stopped answering your calls." "You said you didn't want revenge," Tyler hissed. "You said the shop was sacred." "It is," George replied. "That's why I'm not burning you down. I'm giving you the option to walk. Right now. With what little dignity you haven't already sold." Tyler held the folder to his chest like a life vest. His voice was small now. "You really mean it? I'll give you a day. Disappear. Cleanly. I see your name again, on paper, in print, online, and that whole file goes to the Federal Securities Division." Tyler looked toward May. She didn't move. "I didn't ask for this," he mumbled. "No," George said. "She didn't either. But here we are." Tyler's shoulders collapsed inward. His body had aged 10 years since walking through the door. He turned, picked up his phone, and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. Not slammed. Not dramatic. Just final. May stayed still for a moment. Then she turned toward George, slowly. "You meant it?" she asked, barely a whisper. He nodded. "You're keeping me here?" His voice cracked slightly as he answered. "You belong here." Tears welled up in her eyes. She turned back to the workbench, blinking fast. Picked up a carving knife. Steadied herself. George sat down beside her, rolled up his sleeves, and picked up his chisel again. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, legacy had begun again, not with capital or contracts, but with hands, covered in sawdust, and steady as stone.